The Childless Woman, The Season of Asiyah, February 2020, Chapter 2.2 by Leela. The subject of abortion has always been political, with Planned Parenthood popping up in areas of color with the assumption that people of a certain demographic will never prosper. So the need to abort babies from underprivileged mothers is put forth as a necessary solution. Is it though? And what about selective abortions in China? This is all reminiscent of a story about large birds overpopulating an area, but they were too big to move, so men destroyed their eggs to reduce their numbers. The birds were controlled through their eggs, much like mankind is controlled through the ovaries of women. As it stands, there is much interest or concern regarding the compounding of black people in Africa and abroad approaching 2030 to 2050, considering the global world and its insistence on, quote, democratic rule. Something to think about, and the fact that other DNA can be extracted from African DNA. Abortion clinics were found to be illegally selling parts of fetuses to other pharmaceutical companies, while there's an increase in viruses, vaccinations, with certain politicians and corporates doing so much, quote, philanthropic work in Africa and South America with their, quote, population health clinics. How convenient. Their claim is to give women more rights over their bodies, but any woman who has had an IUD stuck in her while the doctors resist taking it out, and who has dealt with the medical system regarding her reproductive health, has found her authority regarding her body undermined in every other way. I don't believe for a second that the same government that fosters a rape culture in prisons and communities cares about women's authority over their bodies. And do they assist with poverty while they soak up taxes for their private indulgence, leaving women and children to struggle in destitution? I have rarely found a doctor or nurse to honor me or other women with our request for basic health care and assistance regarding the IUD and contraception. There are too many doctors and nurses in the system that treat us women like cattle, then expect us to believe that they will gladly abort our babies out of concern for our right to, quote, have our bodies back. As if our bodies weren't transient and on their way to the grave, back to the soil, dust to dust. But I digress. I'm drawing a parallel between two situations. So getting back to the Queen. The Queen had everything but one thing. It's also been mentioned that she may have had a child but lost it, but more on that later, inshallah. While she sat still and seemingly calm, suffering the sense of an empty void or perhaps loss, another woman was dealing with a very different challenge. She just had a baby boy within the year when boys weren't executed by Egyptian soldiers, but then quickly found herself pregnant again due to the susceptibility of conception soon after birth. She didn't know if it would be a boy or a girl, so she hid her pregnancy from the whole community. Since there were soldiers, spies, and traders to Bani Israel everywhere, she spent months in hypervigilance while tending to her family and work duties. What led to that situation? Pharaoh had a dream that a fire came from the camp of Bani Israel and it attacked the Egyptian section, but not the Israelites. He woke up with a sense of urgency and felt the warning in the vision. So he asked his spiritual consultants, supposed spiritual consultants. They told him that a male from Bani Israel was going to topple his rule. He then ordered the execution of all their male children. He intended to protect the status quo of economic order, thus protecting his position at the top. His, quote, position as God above others, end quote. This depends on their willingness to be underneath him, and being so dependent on the abused sacrifice of others makes this position that much more ridiculous, and his claim to godhood that much more so. Allah is Al-Khani, the independent. He stands on no one. To him belongs the principalities that submit. The Creator encompasses his creation from every direction. Good men are blessed with enlightenment when they purify themselves more and are increased in virtue. But mean, self-centered men are cursed by an ever-increasing stupidity, obscene vulgarity, and rampant heedlessness that leads them into self-destruction. They are just a test for the believers, a temporary test. So instead of taking caution from the dream, he goes and provokes fate further with his crimes against Bani Israel by killing their newborn males. Those little souls sped over the bridge of Dunya, dragging their grieving mothers by the umbilical cord with them when it was their turn to cross over. Such was their heavy test, and God knows what a heavy test it was. In the first year of the order, pregnant women and women giving birth were suddenly confronted by this evil action. Imagine being pregnant and being told that if you have a boy, the authorities will kill him. The mere mention is traumatic. The stress impacts the rest of the children. The woman broke down in intense screaming hysteria, and the fathers and husbands of Bani Israel were helpless to defend their families, but they kept on with their work and lives. Their morale was broken down more by the state, weak and weary, hopeless. But maybe God's promise will remain true. Perhaps there's compensation in the afterlife. People can only move forward and hope or perish in their doubts. Did they all collectively grieve beneath the weight of the genocide that brutally crushed them with the weight of, quote, you may think you are God's people, but you are dispensable, rubbish, and less than human. We have the power. We can slit the throats of your offspring like animals, because all you are to us are enslaved mules, only fit to carry us. We own you. We own you. End quote. How many people from how many nations and from how many races have experienced that degradation and iniquity? How many people have been slammed with this violent message through sadistic actions, whether it was the white cops grabbing South African youth and shooting them in protest, or hashtag Black Lives Matters in reaction to, quote, right-wing infiltrated police in America, or Mexicans having their children taken from them in detention centers only to find that they had been abused, or children abducted in Congo and forced to join rebel armies funded by the US, or children of refugees fleeing the bombs dropped on the Middle East, or violence of Africa then separated through transit and auctioned off through trafficking, or the heinous acts committed to small children and their mothers in Myanmar. Now, I haven't forgotten the Holocaust of Nazi Germany, nor have I forgotten the Palestinian youth abducted by Israeli soldiers either. As mentioned in the previous chapter, Bani Israel were perhaps so accustomed to the abuse that many of them were numb and lost the energy to fight the system. That is, after all, the system intends to break people down so that they lose their self-esteem and the faith that they might win or defeat the odds one day. The system thinks it's God. Pharaoh thinks he's God. But there is no God but God, and while the bad guys plan, Allah plans best. In the meantime, Bani Israel continued in their grinding toil. It's easy to imagine one of them taking a glimpse of Queen Asiyah among the royal entourage across the river. She is so polished in her still demeanor and never fidgets. A queen hardly moves. She doesn't have to. When she waves, it's stiff and slight in movement. Boisterous movement in wild flowing dances more for those at the lower levels of the Titanic where the peasants stomp, or that of saucy concubines. If the royals and nobles dance, then it's graceful and poised. Is this perhaps why certain men respond to women when women are more quiet and still? Because that commands attention from men who see themselves as kings, especially when they seek to please their queens. If she is receptive and inhibited, then she's like a queen. And if she's a queen, wouldn't that make the man a king? Many men would like to feel so, at least in their homes. Just like a stone at the top of the mountain is touched by the coolest air, it has the most spacious view of the free landscape, while the other rocks are squashed underneath by the weighty pressure, eventually becoming gemstones. The few rocks at the top remain cool, detached, and aloof, slippery stones on the top that sometimes disappear. At least this is how Asiyah would have been perceived. Was her inability to produce an heir as the then main wife to the king, or her loss of a child, a punishment from the God of Bani Israel? No. He had many wives and other children from other women. The personal struggle for Asiyah was more on her interest in being a mother, and if she did lose a child, then that would have intensified the trauma of being childless. Somewhere along the river, a completely different situation was emerging that would soon collide with the events of her life. The mother of Blessed Musa, aka Moses, gave birth discreetly enough to go undetected by soldiers and other people passing by. She had 2 children previously, and since there were no C-sections back then, it is safe to assume she gave birth at least twice naturally. This means she knew how to breathe instead of scream, and she knew how to focus on her inner muscles while pushing. If it were her first baby, then it would have been a lot more difficult to stay calm and not panic, as we will be discussing in the chapters of Miriam when we look at how she gave birth under the palm tree, inshallah. Once the baby was born, she saw that it was a beautiful boy and quickly nursed him to keep him passive as instinctively instructed. She then received a very specific inspiration to place him in a basket and let it float down the Nile with the promise of his return. She may have felt a strange energetic calm as she proceeded and then asked her oldest daughter to follow the basket and watch its direction. The basket danced with the tiny reflections of sunlight upon the water until it made its way toward the queen's camp. Understandably, the girl was worried at first. Her baby brother was headed straight towards the enemy's den. There was nothing she could do but watch in horror. He will probably be killed, she thought. But Allah wrote upon Asiyah to be nothing like her husband. At the same time, her mother was losing her confidence, like many of us do. Some say the queen noticed the basket and was intrigued by its movement. She felt drawn to it. Alternatively, it was a group of Pharaoh's family, including one of his daughters, who was involved in finding the basket, but it was the wife who had no child who requested that it be brought near, and one of the servants delivered it to her. She looked inside and responded with delight. She had fallen in love with the healthy, dark brown baby with thick curls, clearly a baby from Bani Israel. There was a rushing flood of rahmah that was ignited from the 10% of Allah's mercy split into the physically known universe and spilt into it. This gushed forth through the heart of Asiyah and burst through her stature like a powerful blast of affection that couldn't be contained. The protective and encompassing energy that surrounds the universe in its delicate decree was now pushing through her maternal being and stretching its spiritual branches towards the baby. As a woman, as any woman, she would have been in that moment anything but aloof. She either approaches or is approached by Pharaoh, but either way boldly tells him, "This baby, you will not kill him, but let me raise him." With a voice full of love and power like a mother who fights a wild animal off her child. He agrees to her requests but dismisses the baby otherwise, typical of his heartlessness, but his lack of ambition regarding the child may also be due to the blessing of protection, manifesting over the boy and later through him. But then the baby starts to cry for food. This could easily be a few hours after his last feed, and he might have slept on his little trip down the Nile, or at least part of the Nile, or an extension of the Nile throughout the delta and one of the smaller rivers. Babies usually need to feed every 3 to 4 hours. His cries are now the rude awakening. This is the reality of motherhood, and Asiyah must make sure that he is fed, or she risks losing the one baby she had an opportunity to raise. She's attached. A few wet nurses tried to get him to latch, but he wouldn't take to them because he was already connected to his mother's scent and was made to refuse the others. It was at this time that the soldiers brought forth a little girl spying on the queen. She quickly explained that she was watching the peculiar motions of the basket and then suggested a very good wet nurse for the baby. The soldiers promptly fetched the mother of Musa, who was on the brink of despair. He immediately lashed to his biological mother, unbeknownst to the queen and her servants. She had Aharon the year before, and he wasn't yet and still in need of breast milk as well. Not for much longer, though. She had an excuse for having milk with his older brother, but when asked why the baby rejected the others and not her, she said that her milk was sweeter and no child could deny her. There's a neurological connection between the baby and his mother when she is feeding him. Both their brains are stimulated and her ducts are activated to accommodate his nutritional needs. It is for this reason that children who are suckled by a woman are considered biological relations to her offspring. The queen was relieved and grateful. She offered the wet nurse to stay with them, but she had another small child and other responsibilities at home. So the queen agreed to let her take the baby back to feed him and offered her a regular stipend for her time. Breastfeeding is a very time-consuming activity in the first few months. It's amazing how modern society expects women to feed their children and go back to work. It's forgotten that this was something that women were paid to do because it was their time spent. It was even a profession for some women, but now we only have tins and teeths while most of us are expected to get it right by institutionalized medical staff, putting stress and pressure on mothers still recovering from the births they weren't coached for or cut open to heal longer. In the old days, women were available and paid to do this for a reason, Because although breast is best with a huge variety of antibacterial properties and nutrients, the reality is some couldn't do it then and are even less equipped to do it now. A woman must feel relaxed and comfortable feeding her baby. The breast fascists at the hospitals and clinics make her feel judged and put way too much pressure on her. The lack of accessibility to breast milk is a product of our new industrial social pyramid, which has dismantled the beneficial role of women to everything else. If I couldn't get my baby to latch in the old days, then someone was paid to do that for me. Today, all women, including those who have that talent, are working to make ends meet. That profession doesn't exist anymore. It's as if modern society doesn't want to reward women for being so sedentary. She must slave more actively to earn her keep. She can't just sit and be a mother to sustain vulnerable life as if that were something inferior or less important. It's strange that now women have the right to abort their babies in their wombs, killing innocents, inflicting womb trauma on themselves, and assaulting the cells of their bodies with a variety of confusion that leads to further diseases and conditions, in addition to the negative karmic payback that hurts future relationships and livelihood. And yet a woman can't refrain from breastfeeding her child if she doesn't want to or can't. It's even weird to think of another woman breastfeeding our children, yet it was the norm throughout history and the world. Even the Quran instructs it as a legitimate profession. Now, getting back to women who can get their babies to latch well, the mother of Blessed Musa is a great example of trust. She put her trust in her creator, but let's face it, she was inspired to do so, wasn't she? Because she wasn't just getting, quote, good karma or reward, end quote, for trusting her Lord. There was a much bigger plan at play that she found herself a part of it. She was then receiving provisions from the queen and was eating well, and so feeding her sons well along with the rest of the family. This may have also given them leverage in the community. As for Queen Asiyah, there is a reason for everything. Within the sacred space known as the Rahim, or womb that conceives, there is always the word that says be, and so it is. Allah whispered something different into Asiyah's womb that impacted mankind in a much greater way. Society frowns upon women and sometimes men who fail to breed. And at the very least, a woman might feel inadequate if she can't conceive or deliver a child. Allah asks rhetorically in the Quran, are you the growers or are we the growers? Do we consider the real reason behind the childlessness of a couple? Do we consider that there is a greater plan at hand? Asiyah could have very well adopted Blessed Musa if she had children of her own, but with the absence of children, there was a stronger justification, concentration, and focus upon the young man and his upbringing. As much as her inability to have children created space for Musa's unique privilege, it is also observed that women who can't or don't have children exercise their maternal energy in a variety of ways. They impact the world by building schools, sponsoring projects, fostering abandoned children, flourishing and nurturing professions, and branching out in a variety of activities around the world. Woman has the sacred space called the womb, or in Arabic, the Rahim, which shares its root with the word Rahman, mercy or grace, and Rahim, especially merciful and gracious. Then she will be a mother in her spiritual and energetic state. She is a maternal being radiating love and flowering compassion that channels great strength and reveals such sweet softness to the subjects of her charity. Blessed Musa was not some trending pet for Asiyah to play with. He wasn't an exotic baby for a celebrity to pose with or dress up for attention, but a small defenseless infant she felt a strong pull towards. Allah wrote for the two women to unwittingly conspire for the boy to have the best of both worlds. He was the biological son of a deeply intuitive woman of faith and the foster son of not only the queen, but more importantly, a woman of noble character. With this potent combination fueling the development of his morality, he would later grow up to be the man that would lead a nation to freedom and lay down the laws of its future, but also inspire the apparent demise of the delicate queen. So what were the events leading up to that fateful day? To be continued, inshallah. The childless